Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Flinchball, host of People Solve Problems. And today we have with us Jacob Stoller. Jacob, how you doing?
I'm fine. Great to be here.
Great to have you. We've talked several times before, never in podcast form, but you're a journalist, speaker, facilitator. You were the author of Lean CEO. You have a new book, Productivity Reimagined, that's forthcoming. Been a journalist with a strong affinity for lean principles, and lots of experience demystifying complex topics. And so tell me about I kind of started this podcast on the back of having a new book.
Right.
So tell me about your new book, Productivity Reimagined.
Sure. Okay. Well, when I wrote the Lean CEO, it was, very focused on lean and what is the executive kind of approach to lean. Is there an executive playbook? And what I found out was there were some, not so much a playbook, but I think there were some basic truths and basic beliefs that were driving these executives. And I talked to other people as well, outside of the lean community, and I found out that there's a lot of common ground. I mean, these basic truths exist outside of the lean world.
Hmm.
People doing sustainability initiatives, people doing anti-poverty initiatives, people working with trying to make workforces more inclusive, and also with technology, people trying to implement technology. They run into the same kinds of barriers in organization that the lean CEOs ran into. So the common thread to all this is productivity. I mean, you have a strategy where you want to produce more with less, basically. You want to take your existing resources and you want to increase your output with those resources. So how do you do that? And that's what I decided to focus on with Productivity Reimagined.
Great. Well, and this is a concept, obviously, productivity. It's one of those words you say, and everyone assumes everyone else knows what you mean. But ask people to write down even a definition of productivity, and you'll get a bunch of different answers to that. So it's worth reimagining. So I like the ambitious effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, everybody has their own idea. And of course, you read productivity in the news. It's just about GDP divided by the number of workers. Okay, that's a useful number in some ways, but it doesn't really tell you if you have a productivity problem, how to solve it, right? And one of the, I can give you some examples of how that gets conflated, but one of them is that when we're measuring productivity, you have to be able to factor out something which is called price recovery, which is the difference between the price change, say, between time A when you're measuring productivity and time B, right?
Hmm.
And price recovery has enormous influence. I mean, you have cost of labor, you have cost of materials, and so it's very difficult to separate those out. And actually, I spent a lot of time in this book talking with Ori Fume, who very patiently took me through the whole question of price recovery versus productivity. And it is not easy to measure that.
Right.
But people assume they know what productivity is. I think that's the worst part of it when they actually don't. And as a result of it, if they've got productivity problems, they don't have a clue of what to do about it.
Right. No, and first of all, any conversation with Ori is a fun and interesting conversation, and yeah, I'd say a lot of, especially in North America and especially in the U.S., nobody dealt with inflation since the '70s, and so
Mhm.
as it affects things like their metrics, whether it's inventory or anything else, they weren't
Mhm.
prepared for it. That certainly exacerbates those problems when you don't know
Mhm.
when things come and go. So. I liked how you said when your first the Lean CEO book about basic truths and principles,
Mhm.
basic beliefs, and I would think one of those is the idea of exposing problems, right? Even the idea of metrics of around productivity, you kind of say, well, how do we fix it then? Um, so the goal is to expose problems. The goal is to
Mhm.
help us
Yep.
find problems. Uh, so, the antithesis of that is that we spend a lot of time hiding them and
Mhm.
avoiding them, just avoid dealing with those problems. And so tell me a bit about that perspective. Why does that happen, or where does it come from?
Yeah, it's sort of baked into our culture very deeply, I think, that organizations function in a certain way. I mean, you have this pyramid structure, top-down pyramid structure, where the boss knows all the answers, where each component in the organization should be managed separately, and then you will assume that if all the components are managed separately, then the whole equals the sum of the parts, and everything will work. So, the thing about problems, as you know, is that they flow across departments and into different areas. And so bringing up problems very often are threatening and very disruptive to the kind of tidy sort of pyramid type structure that companies like to have. So you're not just dealing with, sort of behavior change in terms of accepting what people say and being a little more open. You're dealing with a whole way of how the organization perceives itself and how it functions. So I think that's why it's such a long journey, I guess, when you're doing something like lean and when because you really are changing the culture behind it.
Right. Yeah, and I think that idea that problems expand across the nice organizational boundaries,
Mhm,
right? They're just lines on paper. That
mhm,
pyramid and those blocks, they're just lines on paper, but
mhm,
it's not how we actually work.
mhm.
And
Exactly.
it's not how things get done. Um, so what's the key, or what are the keys? How do you make those problems more visible when they're so threatening?
Well, there's really, I think this is the real reason why when you're doing a kind of transformation, you really need to think about the culture at a very early point. It's because the culture is going to depend on a kind of a level of trust where you trust your people to bring up problems because you're not, they're not. If you trust them, they're not going to just make excuses, right? I mean,
Right.
there's always a two-way street. It has to be give and take here.
Yep.
Someone brings up problems. It's not an excuse. It's just I really don't have what I need to be successful. And then leaders again have to realize that they have to pull the end on every once in a while. I know they're trying to make their numbers. They're in a hurry, but there has to be a willingness to say, okay, we're trying to build this company long term. We want to build long-term value, and when we're building long-term value, problems are our friends. They're not our enemies.
Right.
But that's a huge leap. It takes a lot of, and I'm sure when you go into organizations, that's a ton of work that you have to do.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, and changing the culture becomes a big part, right? So we have old phrases from
Hmm.
Lean that say no problem is a problem.
Hmm.
Teach us that we should expose them. We build systems, as you mentioned, like Andon, to help make it easier to expose them,
Hmm.
and then we get the right culture in place, the right behaviors in place to help make that work.
Hmm.
Um, so what are some of the starting points to make exposing problems or reduce the hiding of problems? So culture is a big one, right? So that's a one that's sort of a perpetual journey. What are some of the starting points that makes that a little bit easier?
I think at the beginning you've got to get rid of conflicting KPIs. And I'll just give you a quick example. I mean, there are tons of them, but in mining, I do some work for a company that maintains mining equipment, and you get the problem that they have is that the operations people have a KPI around availability. They want their equipment running all the time,
Hmm.
and they don't want to give it up for preventive maintenance. But the maintenance people have a KTI based on breakdowns, right? So they want to do the preventive maintenance, and so the two are in conflict. And what happens is the operations people win out, and then the equipment breaks, and everybody loses, right? So you really need to sit down with those KPIs, and deal with those. But they're so entrenched. that companies, even if the CEO is aware of it, it's very hard to make those changes.
Yeah, KPIs and conflicting KPIs can have a lot of they affect what we pay attention to. They affect what we get, how we get paid, how we get
Hmm.
incentivized, et cetera. Um, so what would better KPIs look like that help us move forward?
Okay. Well, I think the value stream approach is brilliant, right? You'd be looking at the equipment, sort of delivering value from end to end. You would have to have those maintenance and operations people sitting down at the table together because they're going to have the same, they're going to be have the same measurement that they're trying to attain, right? So
Mhm.
I think getting people on the same page is incredible. I think value streams is great. I think also, and this is something I learned from some of the case studies I did around where they were using Deming principles, which is really actually very powerful in a lot of ways. But there's several companies in my book actually made huge strides by simply getting rid of their management by objectives kind of rating and ranking system. They simply got rid of those. And that apparently, Dr. Deming, in his later life, that was the first thing he told companies
Right,
to do. He
right.
said, get rid of that. So that's another approach. And of course, that gets replaced with a much more, you're doing your annual reviews or whatever, it becomes more of a two-way conversation.
Yeah, I think it's very different. I sometimes just use words of metrics versus indicators versus
Hmm.
something else
Hmm.
to talk about. Sometimes there are metrics, and when we have a management by objective environment, then you're getting paid based on that
Hmm.
metric.
Yeah.
And so it's about performance. In other cases, metrics should be about curiosity, right? They should be there to
Yeah.
help us ask questions. And it's really hard to ask questions when we know, it's perhaps making it a bit harder to achieve success. So I think that's part of that I don't want to say balance, but dichotomy in how metrics are used in organizations. They were
Hmm.
often there at the beginning just to understand what was going on, be curious about. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah. And there's nothing wrong with measuring things, and certainly we do tons of that in the lean world. But it's the intent, I think, is to support people, help people work together towards a common objective,
yeah,
not to isolate and segment people so that maybe they would be pitted against each other.
right. Yeah. So it's
Or
not the existence of the metric, it's how we think and relate to it.
Yeah. And I think what Deming said was that if people are paid on based on a sort of an isolated metric, they're going to game it.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. We used to call that manufacturing 101, how to beat the system. It's
Hmm.
one
Yeah.
of the
Right.
first things you start to learn.
Yeah.
Um, so tying this back to productivity, what are some good examples or a good example of productivity measures in an organization that help move you in the right direction from a value stream or more inclusive perspective?
Yeah. And this is actually uh, not all that easy to answer because productivity, in the pure sense, is not a measurable thing. And the reason for that is that you can't have quality, or sorry, productivity without factoring in quality. I mean, I give an example always with ballpoint pens. I'm always scribbling with a ballpoint pen, and I say, but if I make 10,000 of those a day, and then I uh, move that up to 10,500 or 10, whatever, I've got a productivity gain. But if those pens start skipping or something and I get defects, that productivity gain is basically, worthless
Mhm.
because I've impacted the quality. So you only know quality gains if you can keep, or productivity gains if you can keep the quality steady and and get more. So it's very, very tricky. You can't just aggregate your sales numbers over the number of people in the entire company and expect that to be a meaningful number.
Yeah.
You know. So, yeah, I would say you have to do things. Now, I mean, I go back to something like wire mold, which was illustrated so well, right? Said if we deliver earlier than our competition, if they deliver in 4 weeks, we deliver in one, we're going to win the business. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty clear, but it's not, and that's way better productivity. But we're increasing things that actually impact productivity. Um, inventory turns,
Hmm.
things like that.
Right.
So we really have to look at the contributing factors to productivity, and give up on the idea that we're going to have this wonderful omnibus figure that's going to tell us everything we need to know, because it just doesn't come out that way.
Well, that's pretty significant, right? When we think
Mhm.
about don't seek the perfect productivity metric, but
Mhm.
instead unpack it, right? Understand what's underneath
Yes.
it at a systems level and what's working for you, what's working against you, what's stable and what's dynamic. I like that idea just around
Mhm.
what's stable. If it's the same number of defects, it's a
Yeah.
much more stable, even if it's high.
Yeah.
At least you know what.
And I think, Jamie, I think what's hard for a lot of people is that the logic of improving processes defies financial logic.
Mhm.
I mean, if you were to tell an accountant that if I improve quality, then my costs are going to go down, they'd tell you you're nuts, you know? But so it's this magic of process improvement that, like I say, it's not financially logical. Uh, and that's that's one of the big jobs we have. I'm sure you've been in that conversation.
Yep, there's a few lean accounting books on my shelf, and
Yeah.
hence the conversations with Ori and others.
Hmm.
That's it's not always built for enabling that success.
Hmm.
I'm curious with all that in mind, as an author, uh, do you do you have a productivity measure for writing? How many words or pages
I
per day you want to achieve?
I do, Jamie, and some of the best sort of resources on writing advise that. And yeah, I mean, I wrote the draft with a quota of 1,300 words a day. I often exceeded it, but that's how I wrote the rough draft. It's word count, and you just got to crank it out.
Yep.
And really the best writers did that. Even famous novelists, they sat down and they made their numbers of words.
Yep. Yep. One of the most interesting books I read was Rituals of Creative People. I don't know if that's the title, but it's
Oh, really? Okay.
covers all these authors and painters and what are their daily rituals, and yeah, that productivity of what am I producing um, applies to individuals too, right? So for those of us that are not part of an ecosystem. Um,
Mhm.
so for the people that pick up your book, what do you think? A lot of it becomes I'll say, an expose on this topic of productivity and how to proceed,
Mhm.
and how different companies have done that. What do you think people might take away as a surprise? What might I don't want to say shock them, but what might they not be expecting that they read in your book?
I think the surprise, and was the surprise for me, is how much of that thinking goes not only outside of lean companies, but that you can find it and say, I talked earlier about environmental initiatives. So, for example, there's a sustainability company that does wonderful sustainability projects, but they don't do it by doing the fancy sort of, oh, let's put up a bunch of solar panels or something like that. They go in and they conserve, and one of their big areas is food waste. So they waste food waste is enormous in the world. It's
Yes.
it's actually something like a third. And the figure they gave me is that if food waste were a nation, it would be the nation with the third largest carbon footprint in the world,
Wow.
next to US and China. So that's how much food we're wasting. But what he does, and the way he does his work, is by bringing, looking at value streams. I mean, he doesn't call it value streams. He doesn't use that terminology. But, for example, this is an easier example to follow. He did work for a winery And they came to him because the town had gone after them to put in a treatment plant. It was going to cost $3 million, and they wanted him to design it. Well, he said, could I do an assessment first? And they agreed. He went in, assessed their waste, and found out that they were wasting tons of wine by pouring it down the drain. And by cutting down on that waste, they reduced the size of the plant necessary by 50%. And they were able to ship tons, lots and lots of cases of wine that they hadn't shipped.
Wow.
So, but the problem is that people get hired to build these waste plants. They get paid on the size of the plant.
Sure.
So he actually got paid less because it was only half the size treatment plant.
Right.
So, I mean, this is just how this kind of siloed, sort of departmentalized thinking just spills outside of organizations, and it's just the way things run.
Yep.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating example. Thanks for sharing that. So thanks for coming on the show. Again, Jacob Stoller, author of Productivity Reimagined, and I appreciate you having a conversation with me.
Great to talk with you, Jamie. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the People Solve Problems podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. Visit jflinch.com for more episodes and other content. And continue to join us on your podcast app, of course. We greatly appreciate your feedback through reviews and ratings. Consider expanding your understanding of problem solving with Jamie's book, People Solve Problems: The Power of Every Person, Every Day, Every Problem. Available on Amazon. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and solving problems.